Hey everybody, welcome to Q&A video number 56. Make sure you keep asking questions, doesn't matter if they're about, they can be about anything. Just know I don't respond to review requests or let's play requests in these videos, but I will respond to them in the comments. And once again, because this disclaimer never seems to work, but I'll say it anyway, the idea of a review request is basically what do you think about insert game here. So please don't ask me that, but feel free to ask me other stuff. The gameplay in the background is of Might and Magic Clash of Heroes. Why? Because I just thought it would be kind of interesting. It's something unusual. I don't normally do puzzle games on my channel very much. This one being a Might and Magic game, of course I'm wanting to review it, so I'll certainly get through that at some point. At any rate, let's go ahead and start with a question from Death From Above 9581. What is your take on the DLC that is released for games nowadays? See, that's a very, very broad question, and I got the feeling it really meant something along the lines of, what do you think about the kind of ridiculous DLC practices going on with things like Evolve and so on and so forth? Well, obviously, I do believe DLC can be done right. And for the very, very few games that I buy DLC for, generally it's done right. For example, I have bought DLC for Dungeons of Dreadmore, and even though I don't really play that game all that much anymore, I do feel that the extra content is worth the price because they put enough effort into making it funny, into making it interesting and unusual, and just things that generally enhance your gameplay experience by enough of a degree that I feel like it's actually worth paying money for. Basically, the DLCs for that game are mini expansion packs. And I have no problem paying for expansion packs. I've always been perfectly fine with expansion packs, going back to things like the original Age of Empires, of course, but even things further back than that. Things like Ultimate Doom or Final Doom or the Atomic Edition for Duke 3D, all sorts of things like that. DLC can be done right. It's basically the modern expansion pack. When it's not done right, it ends up feeling like they're trying to nickel and dime you. For example, what happened with DOA 5 on PC, where the DLC was just ridiculously priced and very clearly just there to nickel and dime you. Or things like Evolve, where they had far too much DLC. It basically just ended up being a DLC platform and not much else. And you're seeing this a lot with the bigger companies that think they can get away with just about anything, where they'll just throw a crap ton of DLC into a product and say, well, they're going to buy it anyway. Not necessarily. And when it proves that they are actually wrong on that, they stop doing it eventually. It might take a while, it might take quite a few non-purchases, but it'll eventually happen. So currently, DLC is in a really weird state where some people do it really well, other people do it moderately well, and still others do it downright terribly, and it's just such a wild and broad topic that you really can't ask a sweeping generalization question. At least not without expecting answers like the one I just gave, where I just kind of had to make sweeping general statements about my thoughts on the whole topic. So if somebody has a more nuanced question with regards to DLC, feel free to ask. Let's move on to a question from the Angry Little Alchemist and Mr. Nyako. I'm guessing is how you pronounce that. And I've been asked this kind of thing before, but these are the two that asked it for this particular Q&A. Do you read manga or watch anime, and which are your favorites? Well, yes and no. I'm very, very picky about what manga and anime I watch and read. So what ends up happening is I tend to go more for the mature themed stuff that tends to be a bit heavier on character development, on story progression, that sort of thing, than action, which is what seems like most of the male-oriented manga and anime just lean more towards the stupid, mind-numbing action with tons of ridiculous outfits on the women and lots of explosions and things like that. Or you end up with stuff like Attack on Titan, which a lot of anime fans I know were constantly telling me, oh, you need to see this, you need to see this. So I gave it a shot. I read the first volume of the manga, and I was not impressed. It felt like Gantz without any balls. And if I want something stupid and action-packed, then I go for something like DBZ, because it's just so stupid, it's hilarious. And what I'm more into is stuff like Rurouni Kenshin or Ghost in the Shell. That's my kind of thing. Or Cowboy Bebop or Trigun. A lot of the classics that were around before anime and manga got popular, and so they weren't really geared toward the main demographic that you see these days, and it just drives me crazy seeing what I see now. I see constantly just these same old things over and over and over again, and I just don't want to watch them, or I don't want to read them. So imagine my excitement when I found out that Ghost in the Shell was getting a new series called Arise, and then I watched episodes 1 and 2 of it, the OVAs, not the alternate architecture. And it's alright, but I just don't get the same magic that you got from the classic anime. There's a reason that Cowboy Bebop and Trigun and Ghost in the Shell come up so often, and it's not just people being nostalgic for them. And of course, when you talk Ghost in the Shell, if you want the really good stuff, you really have to go with Standalone Complex, and of course Standalone Complex Second Gig. The original movie is good, but it's not quite as good as Standalone Complex, so there's that. But I've rambled enough about this for a while. You basically get the idea. There's not all that much manga and anime I actually do like, and a lot of it just isn't the popular stuff. I could not at all get into Full Metal Alchemist, for example. Couldn't get into Gantz, can't really get into Berserk, couldn't get into most of the Gundams. I could get into Wing and G Gundam. G Gundam because it's just so over the top and stupid that it's hilarious. But Wing was actually fairly legitimately good, so I actually kind of got something out of that. But a lot of this popular anime that's out right now, I just don't like. And I struggle to find anything that's actually entertaining to me. One of the most recent ones I came across that I actually rather liked was Sere no Moribito, which is Moribito Guardian of the Spirit, if you don't know the Japanese title. That was actually pretty good. I was very pleasantly surprised with that. So, on occasion I'll stumble across something I actually like, but by and large, I just find myself more and more disappointed with anime and manga. So, I tend not to indulge in that particular hobby anymore, as much as I would like to still be able to indulge in it, but I just can't find stuff that holds my interest. So there you go. Let's move on to a question from ZPS Best Profile Name. How do you feel about RPGs that have enemies level up alongside you? Are there any RPGs that did it right? Are there any that got certain elements right or wrong? I honestly don't know of any of them that actually did it right. The term is level scaling, and the worst example I can think of off the top of my head is, of course, Oblivion, which had absolutely terrible level scaling, where you would end up at certain points, if you leveled up enough, with bandits who had Daedric armor and weapons, and you eventually got to the point where the only way you could actually do damage to enemies is to have a glitched spell that, glitched armor or something like that, that gave you 105% damage reflection. And so you would eventually wear the enemy down just by doing damage to them that they were doing to you instead. It was really weird. And that system was completely broken, so that's the worst one I can think of off the top of my head. But I can't think of any that have actually done it right. And when I go to other games where there is some sort of level scaling, it keeps the same level of power for the enemies throughout the entire game, but it doesn't really do much other than just alter their stats. And that's a way you can do it, I guess. Doesn't really work all that well. It just kind of comes across as stupid and ridiculous. So what I tend to prefer is them just having leveled areas. And what I mean by that is that certain areas of the map have certain levels of enemy there. And you could be very early in the game and stumble across something that's, say, level 30 or higher. You could just do that. And that was your cue to say, oh, I shouldn't go over here. I need to go over to other places, do quests there, progress the story a bit maybe, level up some more, and then I can go back there and find out what they're guarding. And it might well be something really cool. And you don't really get that kind of sense of discovery and this idea of becoming more powerful if everything just levels up with you. It ends up just being boring. And that's exactly what happened with Oblivion, for example. If you even try to level up in that game, you can beat the entire game at level 1. And it's actually a better idea to do that than to just let you level up. Because if you level up, then everything else levels up with you. You don't really get any more powerful feeling, but the enemies certainly get more powerful. So, what's the point, really? Level scaling is not something that really should be a thing. So, don't do it. If you're going to have level scaling, do it in an environment sense, where certain areas just have more powerful enemies than others. And that's how it ends up working out okay. Now let's move on to a question from Ramicide. What is your history with tabletop RPGs? What's your favorite system, favorite setting, and any other things you think would be worth sharing about pen and paper? I've actually thought about doing a video series on pen and paper RPGs and such like that. And I just never really got around to it. I didn't know whether there would be any kind of interest in it, or what I would even cover, because there's so many things I can cover with it. So, ultimately, I don't really get to discuss this kind of thing very much on my channel, so I do appreciate you asking me this. But as far as my history goes, it goes about as you can expect with an American and RPGs, in that I started out with Dungeons and Dragons, and in the long run, I actually grew to hate Dungeons and Dragons. Not because of its setting. In fact, I actually really like a lot of the D&D settings. Like, Forgotten Realms is fine. I don't really like Eberron all that much, but then again, that's partly because I really hated 4th edition. Some of the classic settings, Greyhawk's alright. Planescape was really cool. And I don't know if they ever brought it back, but back in the AD&D days, Planescape was friggin' awesome. Not an easy setting to run, because you had to find a group that was actually willing to do it, and then a group that was actually willing to spend the several hours it would take to really try to wrap your head around the Planescape setting, because it is just so incredibly weird compared to everything else. But that was a really cool setting, and I'm glad that people can actually experience it in video game form with Planescape Torment, because that makes things so much easier to really kind of explain things. But the settings, I like them. No problem with that. My problem lied within the rules, because if you haven't played D&D, it's basically just stat-heavy BS. And there's so many nonsensical rules. Things like THAC0, to hit armor class 0, which, as far as a game mechanic, makes sense, even though it's still really stupid, and they got rid of it eventually. They basically changed it up with something else. And the idea was that you had your 2-hit armor class 0, where you take the AC of whatever you're swinging at, and then you subtract it from your THAC0, and then you roll your d20, and if you roll equal to or higher than what this number you ended up with in the calculation, then you actually hit the target. So, as far as a rules standpoint, it kind of makes sense. But what does it actually represent in terms of plot, in terms of the actual things that are going on in your game? You're not really sure. And then, of course, there's other stupid crap like the conga line of death in 3rd and 3.5, and the mind-numbing stupidity of 4th edition in general, where it's basically been turned into a frickin' MMO. It just drove me crazy. So I got out of D&D, and I migrated to other systems and other settings, and I've actually got quite a lot of RPGs. A lot of it is kind of the quick start stuff that you can get for free, so I haven't really played a lot of this stuff, but there are some things in there that I have actually played considerably and other things that I haven't played as much. But by and large, my favorite RPG is World of Darkness. Now, this is a kind of weird one, because when people talk about World of Darkness, usually you hear them speaking about Vampire the Masquerade. Now, I really, really like Vampire the Masquerade, but I actually prefer the new World of Darkness rules. Vampire the Masquerade is old World of Darkness, so it has rules that are often kind of stupid, where you could have just normal people having a really high soak value and somehow being able to just take a shotgun blast to the face, for example. It didn't make a whole lot of sense. They did away with that in New World of Darkness and changed things up to be more simple, streamlined, easy to follow, without really losing any mechanics from Old World Darkness. And so what you get is, theoretically, the goodness of Old World Darkness lore and everything, which was really complex and full of tons of fluff text and all sorts of things like that. And you get these redesigned, really nice rules. Except that they didn't do that, and instead they rebooted the entire product lineup. So instead of Vampire the Masquerade, you now have Vampire the Requiem, which is terrible. I hate Vampire the Requiem with a fiery passion. Which is partly due to, of course, them removing my favorite kind of character from Vampire the Masquerade, which was Malkavians, because they're just really fun to play. But it's mostly because they screwed around with the lore so much that I can't really follow it anymore. You see, you get really heavily involved in, say, the Vampire the Masquerade lore, which there's this long backstory spanning thousands of years with all sorts of different clans and allegiances and these sort of huge figures in vampire lore, and it's all really cool and kind of pulp horror. And then you get to Vampire the Requiem, and it's basically like going from Bram Stoker's original Dracula novel straight to Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. So you basically go from this kind of seminal work to cheap, pulpy trash. And that's the feeling I really got with Vampire the Requiem. They may well have expanded upon it and changed it, but when last I checked, they just screwed it up horribly. So, screw Vampire the Requiem. However, other World of Darkness settings were not so poorly affected. Like, I really like mages, for example. I actually think they're a bit better in New World of Darkness than they were in Old World of Darkness. Because in New World of Darkness, they actually make more sense to play. So, there is that. The one thing I really hate, though, when you go further and further into the newer stuff, is that it feels like they're getting more and more involved in power fantasy than they are in the kind of personal horror experience that World of Darkness is really supposed to be. And when you get into power fantasy stuff, I just want something that's different, that's completely absurd to begin with. Things like, say, Rune. If you are familiar with the Rune computer game, which is a pretty great hack and slash game with Viking lore and everything, they somehow managed to make a tabletop RPG out of it. And it is glorious and stupid. It has a rule for actually dismembering an opponent and then beating them to death with their own arm. It's wonderful. In fact, I really want to do a video about it at some point because it's hilarious. But there's just so many of these other systems out there and other settings that are so much more conducive to power fantasy. And if you want to do it with the World of Darkness rules, then you can just play Scion. Because in that, you're basically playing gods. And it gets ridiculous. So there's all sorts of things that I do have and that I have enjoyed or that I have not enjoyed over the years. But the favorite is World of Darkness, specifically Vampire the Masquerade. And this video is starting to get kind of long already, so I kind of don't want to keep going on and on about RPGs right now. But if you guys would want me to do a video series on tabletop RPGs, I can certainly do that. And it's something I would certainly be very interested in doing. So just let me know if you are interested in that, and I will certainly see about doing it. And now for the last question from Alexander Yordanov. What do you think of the extreme stupidity some people have written or said about The Witcher 3? When I asked him about what he meant by this, he was referring to things like Anita Sarkeesian and so on and so forth. And I just have to facepalm when people tell me that The Witcher is sexist, or that it's a fantasy world, so you shouldn't have sexism because that's not a thing you do in fantasy worlds and stuff. Yeah, well, you don't seem to have any problems with it in A Song of Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones, now do you? And that's probably because there are quite a few very strong female characters in it. You know what else? The Witcher 3 has quite a few strong female characters in it. In fact, the majority of the strong characters in it are female. You don't get a lot of helpless damsel in distress kind of stuff in here. And men cussing Ciri out when they're fighting her, for example, is really no different from when they're cussing out Geralt. These dumbasses who keep perpetuating this stupid bullshit are just making themselves look even stupider by doing it. All the friggin' issues in this world, and you're worried about a few words in a video game set in a fantasy world where people cuss like crazy, where there's monsters constantly trying to kill you, life is shit, and there is nothing you can do about it. And they're up in arms about someone cussing someone out in a fight just because they happen to be female. What exactly are they hoping to accomplish here other than just generating controversy and generating attention? Because that's exactly what they're doing. They're not actually presenting anything valid that will actually be used to assist in making gaming a better industry. No, what they're doing is padding their own pockets by spouting bullshit. And people keep eating it up like it's the indisputable truth or some stupid shit like that. And people wonder why I'm so cynical and pessimistic all the time. Because I have to put up with shit like this. Well, this particular Q&A is ending on a bit of a sour note, but oh well. I'm looking to make this a more of a bi-monthly series where I do it on the Wednesdays twice a month. What do you guys think about that? Let me know. And like I said, let me know about the tabletop series if that's something you'd be interested in, because I can certainly do that. But other than that, make sure to keep asking questions, because I can't do these Q&As without any questions. And I'll catch you guys in later videos.